Hey, the first step in setting up the mine transactions method is a way to get all the valid transactions from the transaction pool. So luckily we already have an existing method in the transaction class that will check if a transaction is valid. It's a static one called valid transaction. So if you go to transaction.js, you're going to find that we do indeed have a static valid transaction method, which returns whether or not a transaction is okay, depending on its output as well as its input. So our strategy with valid transactions is to go through the transactions map and return an array of transactions that pass this valid transaction check. So overall, we're going to add this functionality by starting with the transaction pool.test.js file. And we're going to describe a new block of tests called valid transactions. So we're going to have a group of tests for a new valid transactions method. To test this method, we're going to build a local array of valid transactions. And then our test is going to expect that the valid transactions method indeed returns this array of locally built transactions. So we have our locally built array of valid transactions. Now, before each following test, we're going to want to make sure this valid transactions array is set. So to begin, we're going to have our before each function set the valid transactions to an empty array. Cool. Now, continuing in the before each function, let's add a loop that builds up a new transaction on each iteration of that loop. And our idea is that in certain cases, we're going to make the transaction valid and push it to the valid transactions array. And then in certain cases, we're going to make the transaction invalid by either messing with its output or its input. So let's do this 10 times. We're going to have a for loop that goes up to 10 by starting with an I incrementer variable. And every time, we're going to reset the overall transaction. So notice that the transaction pool has a transaction variable that's available to all tests. So on every iteration of this, we can set the transaction to a new transaction. We need a sender wallet, which we already have access to, a recipient, which can be anyone. So how about any recipient to make that clear? And the amount has to be valid. So how about 30? And every time we want to set this transaction within the pool, so that way it can actually exist when we call valid transactions on the transaction pool, it should try to find this transaction. But again, for a few of these iterations, let's mess up the transaction. So if we're on the value of I that is divisible by 3, which we can check by the modulo operator. So essentially, if the value is 3 or 6 or 9, we're going to mess with the transaction.input.amount. So that is how we're going to make this invalid. Let's say it's something absurd like 6 nines. Otherwise, if we're at I% 3 is equal to 1, so let's have an else if statement actually. So if it's equal to 1, in which case it would be 1, 4, 7, then we should also make the transaction.input.signature invalid. So this is a different way for the transaction to be invalid. And in this case, we're going to have a new signature generated from a valid wallet, but nonetheless not the matching signature for the transaction. For this, we can sign any old piece of data. So how about a string of foo? And then finally, in all other cases, let's call valid transactions dot push of this transaction, since we're not going to be messing with the transaction in any way. So this case also covers making the transaction output invalid because the output map is going to have a total value that is not equal to the input amount. All right. So with that, we've built up our local array of valid transactions. We have a bunch of invalid transactions within the transaction pool as well, because every time it's setting that transaction, regardless of whether or not it's been tampered with. This now allows us to add a test. So after that big loop of code, we can finally get to an if statement, and we should say that the function overall returns the valid transactions. All right. And the way we'll call this method is that we'll call transaction pool dot valid transactions. And this won't have any parameters. So it can be a method called by itself without passing anything in. And this should be equal to the valid transaction's expected value that we built up using our for loop. All right, so that is the one test for valid transactions. Make sure you have the for loop, which in one case sets the input amount to something huge. In another case, it sets the input signature to something fake. And in the other case, it pushes the transaction to valid transactions. And then make sure you have the test case as well. And with that, head to the command line and fire npm run test. So in the crypto chain project, fire npm run test. And as this goes, yep, it's a red test as we expected. So the next goal is to get this test suite to green. Feel free to pause here and do this as a challenge. Otherwise, head to the transactionpool.js file and let's add the valid transaction method that doesn't exist yet. So we're going to have valid transactions. And again, the idea is that we can take advantage of the existing static valid transaction method in the transaction class. So let's require the transaction class at the top of the file. We're going to set a transaction constant that is the result of requiring the local transaction pool. All right, nice. Now we want to get an array of all the transactions currently in the map, which we can do using the object.values method on this.transaction map. And then JavaScript gives us a nice filter method for arrays, which can take an array of values, but then based on each value passing a condition, if the condition is found true, the value will preserve it in the new filtered array. But if not, the value is removed from the filtered array. So let's call this filter method, and then this takes a callback function. Let's actually place the callback on its own line for readability's sake. But in this case, when we call filter, the only parameter that we need is the one transaction value that we're currently iterating over. And the only line that we're going to call is transaction.validTransaction of that transaction parameter. So transaction.validTransaction will return true if the transaction is just fine. Otherwise, it's going to return false if the transaction has been tampered with, which is great because that allows us to use that as a condition for the filter method for every single transaction value within the array. And now the final thing that we want to do is to return this filtered result. And as we save this, we should find that we have, well, a fully passing test suite. So notice that there's no failures, but we get a lot of red output, and that is because we're getting console errors because of the valid transaction method, which indeed console.errors when there is an invalid transaction formatted. So you notice that it's coming from the wallet transaction method. So in this case, we want to stub that output from the test runner. So in the transactionpool.js file, let's add an error mock next to valid transactions. So we'll have an error mock variable as well. And right after we make our valid transactions variable, let's also set our error mock to an instance of the special jest.fn. Then we'll stub the global.console.error to the error mock. Now, as you save this, the output should be removed from the test running output, but we still want to make sure that the global console error is called, so we can add a test that asserts that the error mock has been called. So we'll say it logs errors for the invalid transactions. Okay. And then we'll call transactionpool.validTransaction, so that way the errors have a chance to be actually outputted and called, but we should expect that the error mock was called. So we'll add to have been called. All right, very nice. And with a save of this, we should have a fully green passing test suite, and indeed we do. Cool. So with that, we've enabled the first part of the mine transactions method. With this new valid transactions functionality over here, the miner is going to be able to get only the valid data from the user contributed transaction pool. The next step is to create a reward transaction for the miner. So let's tackle that next.